Could the UK survive a nuclear war? It's a terrifying question, and one that feels more urgent today than ever before. As nuclear weapons become a looming threat once again, we have to ask, could the UK withstand the catastrophic impact of a nuclear strike? Or would it be left devastated like so many others? In this video, our military experts explore how the UK might weather the fallout of a nuclear conflict. From the government's survival plans during the Cold War to the realities of the hydrogen bombs that can wipe out entire cities. We'll dive into whether the UK's defences, both past and present, would be enough to protect the population, or if the UK, like many others, would be devastated beyond recovery. Let's start things off with a brief answer to the titular question: could the UK survive a nuclear war? In short, it's possible that the people of the UK could live through the onslaught of nuclear warfare. However, the governmental systems that make the United Kingdom into a country that it's been for the past hundreds of years are unlikely to remain. This isn't the case only for the UK, as it's likely that other countries will share a similar fate. But why is that? A significant reason behind the United Kingdom being one of the few countries not to make it through nuclear war is precisely because it's played a big part in shaping the current nuclear-powered world and signed a nuclear non-proliferation treaty. As one of the economic and military giants in the world, the UK is no stranger to nuclear preparedness. The country currently has an estimated arsenal of 225 nuclear warheads and the capability to hit vital targets up to 7,500 miles away with some of them. But what's perhaps more important than the present state of the UK's nuclear arsenal is the country's history in nuclear research, testing, and importance during the Cold War. As you may know by now, the Manhattan Project is widely considered the first successful project to develop a nuclear weapon. The nuclear or atom bomb, created by the scientists involved in the Manhattan Project, relies on nuclear fission, where isotopes of uranium and plutonium are compressed until they are forced to undergo fission, breaking up into smaller, more stable elements. The fission process for uranium and plutonium releases energy in free neutrons, the latter of which collide with other uranium and plutonium atoms to create a chain fission reaction. The consequences of the atomic bomb were seen firsthand with the bombings of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which killed between 150,000 and 250,000 people, effectively forcing Japan to capitulate in World War II. Despite that, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill reported that the atom bombs did not seem unmanageable as the instrument of war. This came from the fact that the UK was one of the bigger contributors to the US nuclear weapons program during the Manhattan Project. In a way, both countries were certain that their knowledge of how the atomic bomb works allowed them to create sufficient countermeasures to prevent the enemy's bombs from devastating their territories. The alliance between the US and the UK didn't last long after World War II ended. In 1946, a series of spy scandals, some involving British officials, deteriorated the relationship between the two countries, although they remained allies. President Harry Truman signed the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, effectively cutting off British scientists and anyone who didn't have proper security clearances and was approved by the Atomic Energy Commission. This has led to the UK pursuing independent efforts to create their nuclear arsenal and possibly improve on the designs of the atomic bombs created during World War II. One of those developments was the potential for upgrading the fission bomb to utilize a different power source to further increase its energy output. This is the concept of the fusion or hydrogen bomb. The fusion process relies on two heavy isotopes of hydrogen, deuterium and tritium. Unlike the base hydrogen, which is made of a single proton nucleus, the isotopes contain 1 or 2 neutrons respectively. These isotopes can be found in traces among general hydrogen atoms or bound in molecules such as lithium deuteride. The fusion process combines the two different hydrogen isotopes into helium, which has 2 protons and 2 neutrons. The result is a hydrogen atom, a free neutron, since deuterium and tritium contain 3 neutrons total, and a large amount of energy, which is partly absorbed as kinetic energy by the neutron. While the fusion process has the potential to generate significantly more energy than nuclear fission, it also requires an astounding amount of energy to start. One of the few possible ways to jumpstart the fusion reaction is with the fission reaction itself. In effect, the hydrogen bomb relies on the previous design of the atomic bomb to be its trigger. The hydrogen bomb thus contains a separate atomic bomb inside. When it detonates, it supplies its energy to the hydrogen isotope fuel, which then undergoes fusion. The fusion reaction creates more energy and free neutrons, which feed back into the fission reaction or into the separate fission stage of the tamper that surrounds the bomb's core. The effect of the hydrogen bomb is phenomenal. A fission bomb is estimated to have roughly 1,000 times the energy output of a similar-sized atomic bomb. As a result, a significant potential of the hydrogen bomb is the ability to make a smaller, lighter bomb that can travel longer or be deployed from farther away. The first tests of the hydrogen bomb were done by the United States at Bikini Atoll as part of Operation Ivy, with the explosion nicknamed Mike Shot. The initial test used cryogenic deuterium, and the bomb itself was too heavy to transport effectively on a plane, making it unsuitable as a deployable bomb. Despite that, the explosion was rated to have the power of 10.4 megatons of TNT. For comparison, the Hiroshima detonation released roughly 0.016 megatons of TNT, which was on an entirely different scale. The next iteration of the hydrogen bomb proved to be far deadlier. Codenamed Operation Castle, the detonation on the dawn of March 1, 1954, was supposed to only have a yield of 6 megatons of TNT. Instead, the actual explosion was rated at 250% of the forecast, at roughly 15 megatons, making it the biggest American nuclear test to date. The discrepancy came from an unexpected reaction with the lithium isotopes contained in the nuclear fuel. As a result, the US realized that the hydrogen bombs were not only possible to deploy effectively, but were far deadlier than the previous iterations and testing predicted. The British soon understood the implications of the Castle Bravo testing. While Castle Bravo was intended to be a private test, it overshot energy release expectations and caused dozens of deaths and significant fallout exposure to the surrounding islands, with traces of fallout detected across the Pacific Ocean. But why was this important? The answer lies in the extent of nuclear war preparation that the British invested in during the Cold War. The first British theories for what might happen to the islands in case of a nuclear attack from the Soviets or another nuclear-holding enemy were developed in 1953. This was a year before the aforementioned Castle Bravo test, so they only outlined possible contingencies for traditional atomic bombs by then. The plan simulated a worst-case scenario of the islands being bombed with roughly 200 nuclear warheads, spread roughly evenly across the major industrial and population centers, air bases, and vital military compounds. In the government theories, the initial death toll would be roughly 1.4 million dead and another 800,000 injured, while 10 million people would be displaced from their homes. Considering that the population of the UK was approximately 50.6 million in 1953, this accounted for less than 25% of the populace at the time. With this in mind, the systems were designed to minimize the death toll, similarly as they would in the Blitz during World War II. The main measures were the evacuation of large population centers and the establishment of underground shelters to allow for short-term survival while the radioactive fallout lost its potency. However, after the reality of what a hydrogen bomb could do set in, a study of the potential of only 10 such warheads being dropped on the UK revealed far more devastating results. Called the Strath Report, the study conceded that the attack would have a death toll of roughly 12 million initially, roughly 9 times as much as the forecast for an attack of 200 atomic bombs. The report suggested another 4 million severe injuries from the blasts of radiation poisoning, which would severely encumber the British healthcare system. The decimation caused by the 10 blasts was predicted to shut off half the country's economy, industry, and logistics capabilities. The rest of the country's food and water sources were likely to be polluted with radiation, leaving the survivors in what was described as siege conditions. The report made it impossible to predict how the government could claw back from the attack of such a scale, rendering any preventative strategy highly unlikely to yield any meaningful results. But this was only the start of the problem. As the countries who had access to nuclear weapons advanced their capabilities, it was getting more likely that the UK wouldn't be bombed by only 10 hydrogen bombs, but by dozens or even hundreds of them at the height of nuclear armament in the late 1970s. This would likely have resulted in all major British cities being turned into craters and much of the island turned into a nuclear wasteland. As such, most governments subconsciously knew that the effort of surviving a nuclear war fought with hydrogen bombs would be effectively futile. However, that didn't stop them from preparing for better-case scenarios, ones which were previously considered among the worst cases of 200 atom bombs being dropped on the UK alone. The Strath Report was shelved and censored from the public, only becoming available in 2002, long after the Cold War ended. The first such plans were enacted in the UK in 1955, with the conversion of the existing Royal Observer Corps, or ROC. Initially created in 1925, the ROC was created with the mission to survey the UK's airspace for incoming aircraft. As planes got faster before and during World War II, the Corps lost most of its effectiveness during the 1950s. As such, the organization was transformed into a part of the defensive systems against nuclear attacks. The ROC would be responsible for providing real-time information on incoming nuclear strikes, as well as the areas that were hit by nuclear weapons. Additionally, the United Kingdom Warning and Monitoring Organization, or UKWMO, was established in 1957 to provide more accurate and timely collaboration between the ROC the government reporting systems, and the meteorological office. This would allow the government to create an accurate forecast of radioactive fallout and its trajectory across the British Isles. The ROC was designed as a reporting unit to provide the British government and subsequently the general population with detailed and accurate reports of the extent of the damage done to the country. As a result, the organization had to be designed to survive the initial blast itself. With that in mind, the British government used the worst-case scenario from 1953 as the basis for planning and organizing the shelters that the ROC would use as the basis of operation. The ROC was provided with 1,563 Royal Observer Corps posts, which were effectively reinforced underground nuclear shelters with above-ground radiation and blast detectors. The shelters were built with a 15-foot deep access tunnel that used a ladder, with the shelter being a 15 by 7-foot room. Each ROC post could house 3 people, 3 beds and a toilet, food storage that would last at least 2 weeks, tools that would interface with the detectors above the shelter, as well as communication interfaces with ROC group headquarters and other government institutions. In the event of an incoming nuclear attack, the ROC post would be manned by 3 people, one of whom would need to check on the above-ground detector equipment. The check would need to be done after the initial blast, but before the fallout started to settle on the ground. The person checking the detection equipment would also be trained to perform all this blindfolded to reduce the risk of exposure to radiation. The detection equipment would tell the ROC from which direction the blast came and whether it was a ground or an air blast. By collating information from all surviving ROC posts, the ROC could interpolate the location and strength of the blast. Furthermore, the ROC personnel would then remain underground, using tools in the room to log the fallout levels on each day and report to its group headquarters. There were 31 such headquarters scattered across the country, each housed in a similar nuclear shelter. The headquarters then reported the data to the UKWMO. When cross-referenced with weather data, it hopefully would have supplied enough information to create a forecast for fallout and radiation levels across the country. The forecast would be broadcast through available radio frequencies to all survivors. This would allow citizens who likely took shelter either underground or away from major population centers to get a more accurate image of what awaited them when they left. Effectively, the ROC and UKWMO were responsible for creating a real-time image of what was left of the UK after a nuclear attack. Simultaneously with the plans to reform the ROC, the British government also enacted plans to protect itself against nuclear attacks. The plan was to build a larger underground nuclear bunker that could house the entire government and the support staff in the event of nuclear war or conflict against the Soviet Union, the only non-Allied nuclear superpower at the time. Dubbed the Central Government War Headquarters, the location of the bunker was kept a secret from its commissioning in 1955 to the mid-1980s, when it was revealed to be in Corsham, England. The location was chosen as a series of existing limestone caves that could be more easily excavated and transformed into an underground bunker. The Central Government War Headquarters was designed to survive the bombs created during and immediately after World War II. It could sustain 4,000 occupants for 3 months, including selected politicians, analysts and scientists, vital support staff and military staff, as well as the Prime Minister and most likely the royal family. The war headquarters was designed to provide vital support for what would remain of the country's military forces above ground, compile reports for the UKWMO, and issue directives and assistance to the general population. However, the Central Government War Headquarters was never fully tested for its efficiency and even survivability. As the complex was commissioned in 1955, it's highly likely that the ballistic missiles designed at the height of the Cold War could feasibly target the headquarters and even damage it. Its commission date is also around the time of the ROC reorganization, but before the UKWMO was founded and the Strath Report was made. This meant that the original designs for the bunker were likely created years before the UK understood the extent of the devastation even atomic bombs could bring, let alone hydrogen ones. Additionally, the bunker's focus on housing government officials, researchers and strategists meant that it was primarily designed as the country's headquarters in times of war. It was designed to lead the country in the war effort against the country that dropped atomic bombs on it. This plan was built upon a serious logical fallacy. It supposed that an atomic war would last perhaps as long as a traditional one, with atom bombs being precursors to traditional forms of warfare as seen in World War I and II, at least for Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The British government at the time believed that as long as it could survive the initial blast, the war headquarters would allow the UK to retaliate and its military to stay effective in the coming years. The concept was given the name of broken-backed war theory in the 1952 British White Paper. It outlined that atomic bombs being dropped on both sides would decimate the economic and military potential of all participating nations or coalitions. The war theory supposed that the countries would scramble to annihilate the opposing sides, using only the available military personnel, vehicles and equipment at the time. The participants' economies and industries would be unable to produce more weapons and equipment. The winner was the country or coalition that could eliminate the remainder of the opposing militaries and destroy the leftover governments in hiding. The war theory came with a significant caveat that all sides would be affected equally by atomic bombs being dropped on the country's territories. Some strategists suggested that this notion was impractical to account for and impossible to predict. It was much more likely that one side would retain a significant advantage and be able to pressure the other into surrendering or risking complete destruction. What the war headquarters was not built to do was to attempt to restructure the United Kingdom in the event of total nuclear annihilation. Unfortunately, this was the far more likely scenario outlined by the Strath Report, which would end up being published in the same year as the bunker being commissioned. Bear in mind that the Strath Report was made after the initial tests of the hydrogen bomb, likely culminating with the Castle Bravo detonation in 1954. The 15-megaton yield of the test was the biggest test done by First World countries. However, the Soviets easily surpassed that in 1961 with the detonation of the Tsar Bomba, which yielded 50 to 58 megatons of TNT. This meant that the Soviets showcased that they could outmatch even the prepositions of the Strath Report, given enough time to manufacture more weapons like the Tsar Bomba and convert them into usable weapons. This process stagnated as a result of the 1963 partial ban on nuclear testing, but the Soviets had access to hydrogen bomb weapons with megaton yields nonetheless. Further advancements of the Tsar Bomba proposed a potential 100 to 150 megaton bomb that could be used in space. As a result, the central government war headquarters was effectively made redundant before it was even commissioned. Its only purpose was to give the British government officials a false sense of security that the country could survive nuclear warfare. In reality, the country would likely never experience prolonged atomic warfare. The more advanced hydrogen bombs could be dropped in a matter of hours. The survivors would be largely left to their own devices. In the rare event that the headquarters managed to survive the initial onslaught, it wasn't clear whether the government could actually reassert itself from a central position and recover the entirety of the UK territory. The second half of the 1950s came with a slight improvement of the plan that hinged on the war headquarters surviving. It proposed dividing the UK governance into regional centres. The first iteration of the plan involved 13 regions, with centres of local government typically designed around large bunkers or military or national defence infrastructure away from population centres. The plan was reorganised in the 1970s by expanding the number of regions to 17, now including larger prisons as potential seats of local government. The regional governments would be led by a single person of authority who would wield absolute power in times of war. The regional government would then be tasked with removing the fallout and managing the remaining resources to help the country recover, as well as maintain law and order in the absence of countrywide leadership. The scenario proposed by this plan ultimately meant that the UK would be fragmented into surviving regions, each of which would likely be forced to fend for itself or attempt to collaborate with its neighbours. Effectively, the governments would be headed by a local warlord responsible for whatever few survivors remained in the area. They would have total control over the local authorities as well as the established food supply. They could enact rationing as they pleased or curry compliance via access to said resources. The destabilizing situation could lead to severe punishment for minor crimes, as the local government would be hard-pressed to establish a long-term supply of food and drinking water, considering their widespread contamination. The situation would likely devolve further, as the local governments would likely attempt to control available agricultural lands. If they didn't, they would implode and leave the general populace to themselves, which would carve out a new order or governmental structure in an attempt to self-regulate. Due to pollution and fallout, mass agriculture would likely become unsustainable and revert the population to depend significantly on hunting and gathering. Effectively, the United Kingdom and many other countries that happened to be in the unfortunate vicinity of a hydrogen bomb blast would be bombed back to the Stone Age. Luckily, the British government itself created a slightly more realistic plan. Rather than supposing that the government would survive in some capacity and be able to guide the general population to salvation, the 1970s outlined a new strategy: protect and survive. Protect and survive was based on the prerogative that the general population could and should be taught about the threats of nuclear warfare. The initiative used several informational campaigns that outlined how the citizens should prepare to survive the nuclear war without any government help. It created more detailed plans for home-built fallout and survival rooms, explaining the necessary equipment and resources needed for prolonged survival without going outside. The informational content also included detailed descriptions of the dangers of fallout and the necessity of retaining communication channels after the attack. The initiative proposed that the previously established UKWMO would be able to maintain a system of radio towers across the country, all of which would be focused on distributing a single radio frequency across the country, the so-called wartime broadcasting service. The service will broadcast once an hour every hour, with early broadcasts following the format found in the pamphlet so people could keep track of them. If the ROC and UKWMO could collate a meaningful forecast of the fallout distribution, the service would diversify its broadcasts. It was estimated that people will be able to leave their homes after at least 2 weeks to survey their environment and start rebuilding. The Protect and Survive initiative was supposed to be distributed as pamphlets or broadcast over all major TV and radio channels on repeat at a time when the threat of nuclear war would be days away. However, due to the uncertainty of its short-term effectiveness as well as massive public interest, the government published the content in 1980. However, it's unlikely that any amount of preparation would help in the event of warfare heralded by hydrogen bombs. A 1980 military exercise called Square Leg estimated that the mortality rate of the general population could reach 65%, meaning that only 35% of the population would survive the initial blast and serious radiation injuries. Even then, it was postulated that the remaining population would be forced to live on fallout-infested lands. Square Leg estimated that the UK will be bombed with 131 warheads with a cumulative explosive yield of about 200 megatons, but suggested that the country could experience an attack with as much as 1,000 megatons worth of nuclear weapons. The worst-case scenario would likely decimate the population and its chances of meaningful recovery. While the UK is one of the countries unlikely to remain standing in the event of large-scale nuclear warfare, there is still some hope. All countries that have nuclear arsenals are in the Northern Hemisphere. Due to a series of defensive agreements, Russia, China, or NATO launching nuclear missiles would likely cause a series of counterattacks. All of these will be directed to territories primarily in the Northern Hemisphere. As a result, the more a country is south of the equator, the more likely it is not to experience the direct consequences of a nuclear blast. Out of all the nations in the Southern Hemisphere, developed countries like Australia and New Zealand would likely have the best possible chance of maintaining countrywide governmental systems. Due to their historical ties to the British through the British Empire, they would likely be all that's left over from the modern United Kingdom. With all this in mind, let's return to more recent events concerning Putin's saber-rattling of Russia's nuclear arsenal. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, the UK has largely dismantled all efforts to ensure the government survives a nuclear war. The ROC posts have been scrapped, sold as private museums, or left forgotten in rural areas. Some were sold to private investors and re-equipped as bomb shelters. The central government war headquarters bunker never saw any actual use and has been partially sold or converted to museums or storage. The Protect and Survive initiative left the public's consciousness after years of irrelevancy. Of course, Putin's threats of nuclear war have proven to be entirely theoretical so far. The country that launches the first nuclear missile will be the first one to be sent missiles in return. Modern detection and long-range delivery systems will effectively ensure mutually assured destruction of all parties involved. Studies in 2022 suggest that people who don't die as immediate casualties of the blasts will be left to fend for themselves in a nuclear winter. With temperatures dropping by as much as 40 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 5 billion people could starve to death, reducing the global population by more than half. It would be the end of civilization as we know it. The war in Ukraine is still ongoing and foretells an uncertain future for all, including the United Kingdom. It's up to the global superpowers to realize that there won't be a winner in a nuclear war, only losers scrabbling for survival. Let us know what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching. Now go and check out why UK has no choice but to go to war with Russia, or click this other video instead.